as you say, your book starts with this image of your mother reassuring you, failing to reassure you about death. And I suppose, in one way, saying it's not going to be painful or frightening. And in some way, it's going to be gentle. So I guess that brings up the question of finitude, which we were talking about earlier. And to what extent is... would you call it a fear in culture, or your fear which you see occurring more widely, which is of one's own consciousness ending, of life being finite? How much of that plays into your desire for God as something that stops your own finitude?
Oh, I think that for me, that's key. And it's, I mean, I mentioned in the book something that atheists say. I think I'd quote Bertrand Russell, and Dawkins has said the same thing. Bertrand Russell said quite famously that he would scorn to the idea of shivering at his own oblivion. He's scornful about the idea that you should be frightened of oblivion. Now, there's two things going on there. Number one is, again, this atheist machismo. It's like, all these fairy tales that people need to make up in order to comfort themselves from the ideas of whatever they're frightened of, principally death, but all sorts of things they're frightened of. I, the great atheist, have no need of this. I don't believe that. I think that's a pose that a lot of atheists take in order to feel kind of grown up and proper and big. But there's something else going on there, which is, I think Dawkins has said a similar thing, but not quite as lofty a way as Russell, which is that why should you be frightened of death? Because you won't know you're dead. And that seems very logical, but it's deeply, for me, inhuman, because you're only saying that from the point of view of life. And from the point of view of life, I promise you, life seems a lot fucking better. It really does. Some people in here might think, well, I find life so difficult or whatever that I find the idea of nothingness sort of more attractive. But I think that's unlikely. I think that one of the things about the book is I
was born in Ipswich, so
well,
we have to relativize this.
When my mum was talking to me, I was living in Dollis Hill in 1973, so I can tell you that, as I say in the book, was a kind of death. But I think the book is powered, and I quote John Updike quite a lot in the book. John Updike, who is my favorite writer and who was a Christian and deeply believed in God. But I think what I share with Updike had an almost hysterical but beautifully written attachment to life. Like he was a late book by Updike is called Terrorist. It's like a lot of Updike books, it's not that good. But what it's about a suicide bomber. And you might ask, why is John Updike writing about a suicide bomber? I think it's because he got old and he thought, I need to write about someone who is in love in the way that I am with life, with death. I need to somehow manage the idea of death and create the love that I feel for life throughout death. He calls life this complex interval of light, which I think is so beautiful. And I think that's the book, if it has a sort of positive energy, because it might sound a bit deathy the way that we're talking about it, but the positive energy is it's a deep commitment and love of whatever life may hold, even though life holds lots of shit things. It's still, for me, better than oblivion. And I think that exists deeply in all of us, even if we might buy into what I think is a slightly religious thing of, well, there's a sort of serenity and finitude.
Can I just come, because I think that the idea of an interval of light is fascinating. I mean, it actually reminds me of the Venerable Bede, the kind of great early British theologian, who I think tells the story of a sparrow flying into the hall, a feasting hall, through one window and out the other, and he says that's an image of life. This brief moment where, from the cold and the dark, you're briefly in this place of noise, music, laughter, and light, and then out again. But it seems to me that part of the conditions for being able to celebrate and enjoy that interval is that it's finite. So there's a curious way in which death is the necessary bookend to all the good things that one enjoys, and a healthy, this is true for anyone, whether religious or not, that a kind of healthy relationship to one's own death becomes a condition for a properly celebratory way of living now.
Yeah.
and without death, and the idea that somehow your life could just stretch on and on, it would cease to be a joyous thing at all.
Of course, but what you're talking now is a kind of like, nice, almost humanist, logical way of thinking about death. The creation of God comes from a much, much deeper psychological soup that is nothing to do with, well, obviously, and I agree with you, obviously life would start to become exhausting and meaningless and weird if you just lived forever. It wouldn't work. That doesn't mean you don't want it. Because wants and desires come from a much more complex, unsayable, not logical place than worked out in your head, like, oh yeah, that wouldn't actually be very nice to live forever. Of course it wouldn't.
Yes, the only thing though is that, well, you've written a book which is logical and worked out and put in those terms, but about psychology. So it's not necessarily the case, or from a psychological sense of why I might desire this. So they're perhaps not in opposition, the idea of something that is worked out and rational and desirous.
Yes, I don't actually completely agree with that. There's a bit in the book where I talk about how God is also, like, it's not just about death. I think God is also, and I use Updike. This Updike talks about how he also, it's a bit about sleep as well, and he imagines humanity as kind of the child in bed being comforted by the sounds downstairs, comforted by knowing that your parents are downstairs. And he talks about how that sort of creates that there must be something beyond, there must be gods, there must be people watching over us. And that mustness, that imperative, is his reason for why there is a God. And it's my reason for why there isn't. Let me just explain something else to answer your question.
I'm going to get the end of pigeon feathers ready.
Oh yeah, well, pigeon feathers is fantastic. But one of the things is that I also talk about God as not just being a way of outsmarting death, but also a way of providing this parent figure. And again, it's not as simple as like, it's just a caring parent. I don't want to get all Freudian on it, but the way that we might, if we were to unconsciously project a parent figure that is always there for us, they would also be angry. They would also be hateful. They would also be difficult. We would also have to be constantly doing things for them that might not match up to what we wanted, because what we are in the unconscious is a soup of anxiety and desire. But I wasn't going to call it The God, Anxiety and Desire, because that's a shit title.
Okay. Well, that can be the sequel, of course. Well,
that may explain, 'cause one of the things that really interests me as well is that there was a theologian, a 20th century German theologian, who then moved to America, called Paul Tillich, and he described. Have you come across?
No, I haven't, except in the writings of John Updike.
Okay, he's in Updike. Okay, and Tillich describes three different things that over. It's a very broad brush sort of meta narrative that probably we ought to be suspicious of. But he describes three different points in Christian history in the 2,000 years where people look to God to sort out three different anxieties, and death was the first one. Interestingly, so lots of early Christian art is centered on the idea of conquest of death, the triumph over death. And the sorts of things that are depicted in art are often moments of victory, and it's either the devil or some sort of visualization of death as a monster or whatever being defeated. And then in the time of the Reformation, it's sin. And so what God does is sort out not so much death, but the problem of sin, because people are really worried about that. And then he suggests that the big modern anxiety is meaninglessness. And you, as you've said in summarizing the book, in a way you deal with the first and the third. And there's a sort of interesting hole there in the middle about the sin one.
You're probably right about that. And it's interesting that I have to bring in Frank Skinner at this point, because I tell this story. I tell this story about how when I first met Frank, I didn't realize how devout and how literal a Catholic Frank was. And we went on a long journey, on a long car journey, and he was explaining to me something very specific, which I think I'm going to tell you because it's in its mechanics, because the mechanics interest me. So Frank at the time had left his wife, and he was living, I think he'd actually got divorced, and he was living with his girlfriend, and he was having sex with his girlfriend. Now that, in the Catholic Church, is adultery, right? And he was explaining this to me, that what this meant was that he couldn't go to confession, because to get confession, you have to confess your sin and then promise not to do it anymore, at which point you get absolution, and then you can take communion, right? And he's explaining this to me over about an hour and a half, because I don't really understand it. And at the end of it, I get out the car at Birmingham New Street Station, and I say to him, sorry, why are you bothered about all this? And he said, no, you don't understand. I think I will burn in hellfire because of this. And I literally had never heard anyone say that. You know, I don't live in 1605. I'd never heard anyone say that and really mean it. And I was really kind of impressed at some level. I didn't think, oh, thus he's an idiot. I thought that's incredibly impressive that he really feels that. That makes him more interesting. I'd only just met him. More interesting a person than I thought. But what it does mean, in terms of what you're saying, and that's probably true, is because I come from, I guess, a Jewish background, and obviously the book is quite Talmudic at some level. Jews don't have much of a conception of an afterlife, and the judgment that is going on for Jews, for Orthodox Jews, and by the way, there are 613 mitzvot, which are things you're meant to be doing all the time as a Jew. As far as I can make out, it's a kind of OCD thing, where you've got to kind of wrap something around your head, or turn off a light, or not eat this bit of pork, or whatever the fuck it is. And what those people, where that comes from, the anxiety and primordial soup that comes from, is anxiety about judgment in this life. And that comes, and I should have said this in the book, this is all kind of interesting, I wish I'd put this in the book. Anyway, second edition, that comes from being a persecuted minority. That comes from the sense that people are going to do bad things to you all the time, and you can't really do anything about it, but maybe if you do all these weird things all the time, they will shield you from it. But what I don't have, I think, is a sense, which you've sort of mentioned, of the idea of judgment in the life to come. And so maybe that is why I've missed that out, because I guess, yes, if you are really frightened in a genuine way of judgment in the life to come, oblivion may seem preferable. I don't think it really makes much difference to my sense that God is still a creation of desire and anxiety, because it's just another type of anxiety.
I suppose part of the question is whether that is as primordial a part of all human experience as the fear of death is, and or whether part of what you've characterized as some of the differences between Judaism and Christianity might suggest that there are more sort of historically inflected circumstances in which some kinds of anxiety dominate. And I guess that's Tillich's point. So it might not be as universal. There might be more sort of more variety in the historical contexts and the cultural and religious contexts in which people need God for different things. So there may be something that's less primordial, in other words.
Maybe it's interesting to talk about, I guess, desire, and what we mean by desire, what you mean by desire, how, I guess you've alluded to the idea that it's perhaps not entirely conscious. To what degree do you choose what you desire? As Updike, I think, said, I chose to believe in God. That he made that consciously, and C.S. Lewis would say, if your rationality gets in the way of your faith, then don't have it, as in it has to involve your rationality. But so I guess my question is, how do you know what you're desiring? Is it by seeing what your life is like and go, oh, I can sort of reverse engineer from what it seems to be I'm projecting? How can you tell what your desires are, I suppose I'm saying? And this isn't to come on.
No. That's a really good question, I think, because I think in the book I am retro-engineering. I am looking at what I think God does in terms of what he serves in the human psyche, and I'm retro-engineering and saying, okay, well, these are things that I feel, which is I am frightened of death, I am frightened of meaninglessness, I sort of wish there was a more universal justice, and I also, beyond that, and that's more psychoanalytical, have a sense that, there's all these anxieties and unknown things. So desire if one is to be Freudian about it, desire would always be something that you might not be able to completely name and identify. So I am assuming, in writing about the God desire, that some of those desires might be at the forefront of your head, and some of them will be almost unnameable. And that is partly why I think the imagination of God isn't just a straightforward thing, and it certainly isn't just straightforwardly a good, nice thing, I think. because I think we're trying to play out all sorts of things that might come under the headline of desire. But I wouldn't be able to say you can name all of them.
Yeah, and yes, what was your response to the question of desire within the book, and is there a specific kind of desire for God that is different from other desires?
That's
I suppose.
A hard question.
I think there is.
Yeah. Well, okay. So one of the classic statements about desire is Saint Augustine, the 4th and early 5th century bishop in North Africa, who says in his Confessions, our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you. He's talking to God. Most of the book is a lot of extended address to God.
In terms of desire, he also says, God, make me celibate, but not yet.
Yeah, there's that great one about that. So continence, he wants continence only when the time is right.
Yeah.
But that sense of the heart being restless until it finds its rest is probably one of the most paradigmatic theological statements of what desire for God is. It's the sort of ultimate rest. It's connected with the idea of ultimate rest. And it's quite proper from Augustine's point of view to desire anything that God has made. So, the world is full of desirable things, and that's good. But the problem, as Augustine sees it, is to desire them as though they're going to give you that final rest. Even those you most dearly love, they won't ultimately abide. And so, there's always going to be a sense of loss and so on. So in a way, he's dealing with some of the same anxieties that you describe of losing your parents and losing your best friend. And he describes these experiences of bereavement in the book. So for him, the key thing about the desire for God is that God is the only object that doesn't let you down in the end. And the way to love things in the world is to love them as if you like, a part of your love for God, or as a way of loving God, rather than as if they were God. Right. So I guess that would be, that's hiding behind Augustine, but that would be part of an answer that I feel has some interest.
But you brought up something there which I think is important, which slightly takes us back to what we were talking about earlier, which is to talk about being very frightened of death can make you feel, in a way, very narcissistic. I sort of deal with this in the book about how early on in my life I read about the idea that it was very narcissistic to be very frightened of your own extinction. And then actually, again, I know we've mentioned him a lot, but Updike in Self-Consciousness, which I think you've got there.
That's under there. This is Pigeon Feathers.
Okay, Self-Consciousness, he talks about how it's the opposite. That what you want, if you want your not to die, is you want to be part of the social being. You want to stay in the party. You want to be with people. And of course, as I've grown older, one thing that's become clear to me as well is that if you want to talk about the front of your head and desires that you know about, other people you love die. Never mind you and your own oblivion. Other people you deeply love die. And actually, early on in the book, when I'm talking about me as a 6-year-old, I'm praying. I'm praying to Hashem, which is the Hebrew word for God. And I'm praying that I should see my mum and dad and my best friend Saul Rosenberg again after I die. Because it is about being amongst people, amongst love, and about the immediacy of friends and relatives and whatever. So I think that's important in terms of understanding when I'm talking about the God desire. It isn't just like my own oblivion that I'm talking about here.
Well, the end of Pigeon Feathers could be written for you when he's describing at the end holding these 2 pigeons, and he says in the book, the slipping sensation along his nerves that seemed to give the air hands, he was robed in this certainty that the God who had lavished such craft upon these worthless birds would not destroy his whole creation by refusing to let David live forever. Right. Well, that's... So just to be clear, if people don't know, so that short story by John Updike is about a guy who has a crisis of faith and then sees a pigeon feather
and is moved by the intricacy of the pigeon feather to confirm his sense that God must exist, because why would so much, as you say, so much incredible apparent energy and thought
and particularly beauty as well.
And beauty, absolutely, go into something. And that's where we get into an interesting thing, which is, so in this book, I don't spend much time, I talk about it a bit, but I sort of like spend quite a lot of time dismissing certain arguments, like I'm not going to bother with that. So I'm not going to bother to get into arguments about what existed before the Big Bang, or is there some kind of designer to the, or whatever, because I kind of think those things are basically unknowable.
No, and what seems very interesting about the book is you talking about what you want, and what's so interesting about it is it's as much a question to you and what you feel your desires are and what could possibly answer it.